Great. Yeah, thanks, Joe. Joe is the CEO of Quardev, and thanks for being a sponsor every other month for what is this PMSIG, program management, product management, project management. I prefer the more program management side. My name is John, and I am a director at eBay of program management in the marketing technologies department. I'm pleased this evening to introduce longtime colleague Rob Sabourin, who has more than 40 years of management experience leading teams of software development professionals to deliver projects on time, on quality, on budget, the trifecta. He's a respected member of the engineering community. He's trained and mentored literally hundreds of top professionals in the field. He's also an adjunct professor of software engineering at McGill University. You can see his screen, his background. It proudly displays the McGill logo. He speaks to conferences around the world on software engineering. I've known him for 20 years. He's just one of my favorite colleagues because of his energy and enthusiasm and experience. So welcome, Rob. So to those of you in the audience, here's how this is going to work. I have 8 questions that I'm going to ask Rob. Rob doesn't know what those questions are. And I'm going to ask the first question, and he's going to answer it. And at that time, you as an audience member are free to either raise your hand, and Shelley will open the microphone for you to speak and ask your question, or you can type it into chat or Q&A, and I can ask it on your behalf. So extrovert or introvert, we accommodate all neurodiversity aspects here at PMSIG. So, but I'll try to time box each of these 8 questions. So it's about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time at the end to either time that we went off the rails in a meaningful way, or just time to jam, as Rob would say, and do some jazz with ideas. So that being said, let's get the ball rolling. So welcome again, Rob. The first question I have for you, as promised on LinkedIn, I think I gave you a hint of what I might ask.
Wait a sec. You forgot to mention the prize money. Do I get $2,000 question? I get them right?
Yeah, that's right. It's in the backlog. It's been groomed. We have to put it on a sprint, and maybe we'll get to that.
All right. Sorry for the interruption.
No problem. That's what I like. It's going meaningful interruption. Okay, so best practices, quote unquote, best practices. So Rob, you're also a context-driven guy. So why not just say practices? What does best mean to you?
Well, it means a lot of things to me. First of all, there's so many people who are standing on a soapbox preaching some sort of methodology and saying, this is the methodology, this is the best practice, this is the way to go. And what they're doing is basically selling to executives on a golf course. You know, they're basically using that term as a marketing, like a cliche almost. And it's unfortunate that it's insensitive. If you use that term, it's insensitive to context. And what I've learned is that there are at least 4 types of context factors that dramatically influence what is best or not best in a circumstance. And I want to be very specific about them. I'm not vague, and I'm not just saying it depends. I want to be very specific about it. It depends on stuff like business. It depends on your business factors. Why are you in business? How are you making money? Are there shareholders? Are you trying to raise capital? Are you trying to get a few early adopters? Where are you in business? So the business factors are huge. And that's influences what would be the best practice in different business contexts. And then there's, you know, I'm in the technology business, so there's technological factors that dramatically influence what is an appropriate practice. And I have to tell you that if I am working on a program that's going to be running on a mobile device that's sitting in someone's pocket, or I'm doing embedded software that's going on a space telescope that's going to be in outer space, millions and millions of miles away, I'm going to have a very different way I'm going to manage and organize the project, the program, or the product. It's not the same. And I'm not just saying that to give you a hyperbole. This truly are subtle things. The technologies do influence it. So business factors, technology factors, and then there's organizational factors. And there's been some great work about organizational factors that have come to my attention in the last few years, although I understand they've been around since like 40, 50 years. But how you organize your business often defines how you will run your projects or how you will get things done. And that has nothing to do with what are the goals and purposes of the project. It's really the framework of organization of your company. And the last 2 or 3 years, well, two years and a bit with the COVID stuff, we've all had to refactor how do we organize things. And that changes what is an appropriate and best practice. And I have to tell you, even subtle little practices, like, for example, having someone double checking what you're doing has dramatically changed in the world of COVID versus when you were sitting at the desk next to someone. So these are subtle things, but the best practices are truly dependent on how you're organized. And then the last one, which is the hardest one for me, and it's the one that I'm trying to learn. I mean, I've been at this for so long. I'm trying to learn how to do this, John. I don't know how to do this, but I know it's huge. It's cultural factors. And I'm talking about not just societal, because there's societal cultural factors that are dramatic influencers, but there's also cultures of practice, cultures of teams, cultures of work ethics, cultures of John, you know very well, value, right? Value sync, the whole idea of that. There's huge cultural values. And so I believe that best practices do exist, but that there's business, technical, organizational, and cultural factors that have to be considered to choose what is a suitable, great practice for you in that context. If that answers your question.
I was just going to say, it sounds like best practices in context, right?
As I would see it, it's not a slogan, and I'm not trying to market best practices. I spent 2 hours today with a customer, which was fascinating, interesting customer. And all I was trying to understand during the whole thing is context. And they wanted me to tell them what's the best practice, what's the tool I should use, what's the approach I should use. You know, they want parachute something on. And I'm still trying to learn their context. And until I understand the context, I don't even want to suggest remotely what they should be doing. Like, I really want to get a handle on what factors are influencing the behavior before I sort of say, okay, maybe we should go this direction or that direction.
Okay, good answer. I mean, I'm satisfied that you've met the spirit of the question that I had in mind. So, okay, all right. Any questions? Okay, let me move on to question 2. You can always come back to question 1 if you want as an audience member at any time. So, okay, question 2. Part of the title is about managing practices. What elements of management to you are universal, like change management or risk management? Are there elements that are universal when you think
I have I can't say, I have never studied to make a generalization of that magnitude, right? So I can't say by empirical study or whatever what is a fundamental truth, but there are some, I think, practices that make a lot of sense and that I've seen very successfully applied in all sorts of different situations. And that is mostly things like situational leadership. You ever heard of that practice? I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's basically saying there's different strokes for different folks. And the way that you choose to manage a situation, the way that you choose to organize and manage a project or a team or even a specific task depends a lot on the dimension of professionalism that someone has, or a dimension of how much are they able to do professional work, and then what is the skill related to the domain, or the sort of vertical dimension of skill, and then there's a professionalism direction. And I see that almost universally. Almost every single person I meet, every single team I've ever worked with, I see that situational leadership approaches, situational management approaches are seem to be always applicable. You know, if you're doing a waterfall project, an agile project, a military project, a government project, a bank project, it always seems to be there. So I think that's from organizational behavior, situational leadership stuff. Basically, I follow the teachings of Harvey Blanchard on that. And I think that's not, I don't know if it's universal, but I see it everywhere.
My follow-up is, okay, so I think I get it, but what is it about the practice you're managing?
Well, that's what I'm trying to say, is you choose your leadership style depending on the context. So yeah. you look at this and you sort of say, hey, well, if I have the same task to do and I'm a manager or I'm working with them, whatever the structure you have, and you're sort of basically saying, what style should I take? Should I be delegating? Should I be coaching? Should I be I don't remember all the names of them, but there's a bunch of different styles of directing people that vary. And I would never delegate something to someone who has a, for example, a low professional experience, even if they had a high domain experience. But if they had a high professional experience and low domain, I would still maybe delegate it. So you choose the approach you're taking to basically giving work and tracking work based on someone's maturity and skills.
Sounds like style is one facet of practice management. Are there any other facets of practice management other than style?
When you say practice, what do you mean? Practicing management or managing practices? I don't know.
Managing practices. So think of a practice,
yeah. So,
and think of the word management and facets of what that might mean.
I was trying to talk to you about the universality of it. So
oh, I see.
That's what I was saying. That there's only one I know that I think is pretty pervasive, and it's a bit abstract. But there's much more practical things that are things that I've seen very successful or very interesting ways that manage practice. For example, the whole phenomena of guilds is wonderful in some companies. It's fascinating. It's a total failure in other companies, but it's fascinating where you can set a guild of people who are like-minded professionals who have common interests and common work types or common tools that they use, and you form this sort of organization within an organization of people who are practitioners in that. And the guilds build communities. And I think that's just fantastic. But you don't see it everywhere. But that's a way to manage practice, is to encourage guilds and to get people to share. And from the experiential sharing, you basically say, okay, how, like everyone shares, how did you do this? What worked, what didn't work for you? And you share examples of what's excellent. But you don't share like templates and stuff like that. You're sharing experiences. And this helps us with what you'd often call tacit knowledge, right? And tacit expression of things. And I think the guild community stuff really is good at that. And I'm seeing it in more and more, but it's still not universal. You asked about universal at the beginning here. So I want to say that I think it's great. And that's the way to go. And it's much better than what we used to try to do a lot, and I used to see a lot, which was the center of excellence notion. And the center of excellence notion for me got really, really carried away, whereas there was like, this is the way to go, and this is our excellence, and this, you have to follow this process model, and bang, bang, bang. And companies had centers of excellence all over the place, trying to do the same thing that guilds do, but not so effectively.
You mentioned best practices, and you qualified it with several contexts like business features, organizational, cultural. Is there then a worst practice in context that you see at a company? In all of your consulting in 40 years, you go in, you go, this is the worst practice I have ever seen in my life. So do any worst practices come to mind that you've seen as pathologies?
Yeah, I've seen terrifyingly bad practices. I never tried to rank them, saying this is the worst practice I've ever seen. But slogan-based quality management, I think, is one of the worst practices possible in the world. And there was years in the late 1980s, early 1990s, where people were writing books about these things and calling it total quality management. And they told everybody needed a mission statement, and the whole thing was, Ford quality is job one and all that stuff. And then you start looking at slogan-driven, mission statement-driven quality, and that's so. I mean, in the end, if you look at it from a distance, it's hilarious. But if you get up close, it's very hard for you to relate it to your work, your job, your mission, your values. And it's something I think it's one of what I think is the worst practice. And yet still today, I see that at companies. There are some companies that are truly believe that having a very good slogan about quality is going to help them make quality products. And I frankly don't think the slogan is what's making good quality products. It's all about people, John.
Okay, so Oliver also in the chat raises a point about worst and best. So it's possible then to have a worst practice in one context be a best practice in another context, or vice versa? Have you seen that?
Yes. That's one of my favorite ones. This is the sort of context of flip-flop thing, where there's a practice that is extraordinarily important in one. And you and I worked on a project together in that area. And I don't know if you remember the on the rails, off the rails testing for the acceptance testing case study that we worked on. And in that project, really following the rules and being formal and getting things done, and heavily scripted testing would have been a fantastic, it was a fantastic, it worked. There was over $4 million that changed hands in that project, and it was successful. but it was because we followed a really rigorous, heavily document-oriented approach to doing it with telcos in heavily regulated environments that could have been that could have lost their license if the project didn't work out. So you have that sort of thing, and on that same project, if we had done, and we knew that there was a fantastic way to develop and test the software using exploratory testing methods, but that would have been ineffective. In fact, we had to break things up and say there's on the rails and off the rails, and we found problems off the rails which didn't influence the decision of the money changing hands, right? The money changing hand was tied to contracts, was tied to lawyers. There was actually legal remedies for bug fixes on that project, John. So that is an example project that we worked on where the best practice in one case, which is exploratory testing, where you adapt on the fly and you can be very reactive, would not have been the way to go.
It's interesting that on that particular project, it was compatibility of these different machines and testing the same thing on every single machine, on every operating system and
well,
configuration.
we had a specific list. There was a
specific list, but we also amended our process to accommodate what Rob had said is off the rails, something that was a bug that we found that was kind of off script by incidentally, we found it almost by accident, but we were to the degree that these cases we were running were subjective and interpreted by different testers in different ways. We would found interesting ideas, and we came up with this new process called off the rails. Like, let's not ignore the off the rails bug if it's not in the script. Let's report it anyway. And then we came up, and there was a nice little sub process that spawned from the on the rails process of following the script. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that processes evolve from other processes based on context and need.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to tell you that that's an example project where you see the opposites. Like, actually, I would say almost always that type of scripted testing would be inappropriate for a project. But in this particular case, it was actually the way to go, and we did it, and we did it very well. So it was a very successful project. If you had just tried to do rapid testing approaches or just-in-time testing approaches, you might have learned the same amount of stuff, but you would have never got the buy-in from all the business stakeholders and the legal stuff. The word, my next question is about the word delightful, which you don't often see used with the word process. But you're such a passionate guy and experienced in so many different contexts. Have you ever walked into a client's problem statement and to do service to what you're hired to do and found that they were doing something absolutely delightful that changed you from that point on, or say, I'm going to steal this. This is great. Well, I have to tell you that, yes, that happens to me sometimes. I get delighted though by seeing a beautiful problem too sometimes. So you got to be careful with me. Like, if I go and see something that's really screwed up and I say, wow, that's a beautiful problem, you really need to use software engineering principles to solve this, because I love the beauty of some problems. However, the case in point where I was delighted was the University of Pennsylvania, and I went in there and they hired me to audit their development and testing practices around all the IT, information technology, the whole university. It was a fascinating project. I went in there, did a lot of task analysis, a lot of looking at where things were going, and I was totally delighted to see the way that they were managing some of the projects with a methodology, which was, they didn't even know what it was, but it was a Kanban-oriented model of doing it. And they had 70 people managing 1,000 projects in real time. And it was like, I was almost in tears when I saw how beautiful it was. And they thought they had problems. And I'm looking at that's the most agile I ever saw in my life. That's the most beautiful thing that I ever saw in my life. And don't tell me it can't be done. If you're organized well, and if people really believe in what they're doing, have the right skills, and know when they don't have the skills to do the job, to say, hey, I need to get these skills somehow, it makes a difference. So yes, that for me was delighted. The University of Pennsylvania IT team, that with 70 people managing basically 1,000 projects, and I had the list of the project, was amazing. This is incredible teamwork, but it's all beautiful Kanban. Lovely done.
Okay, well, speaking of universities, my next question is, you teach at McGill. You've taught students for 16 years at McGill. What practices do you enjoy teaching about?
Well, I really, my favorite part of teaching is, as you know, I bring in guests all the time, and I've tried to show the students that there's a lot of different ways to do things. And so I bring in examples, and I have people share first-person experiences in pretty much 10 of the lectures in 10 weeks. So the semester is like 14 weeks. For 10 of those weeks, I actually have a guest every class, and we take between 45 minutes and an hour, and we walk through how they implement software engineering projects. I sometimes spin it a little bit depending on their background is, but I want to show my students as much as possible that there is no one cookbook method of software engineering, and there's a lot of cool variations there, and sometimes they just make a lot of sense. I mean, we just had one this week, a very, very famous software engineering professional was explaining that they sort of use Scrum, but at the end of every iteration, they don't care if they finished it or not. And I'm looking at, they're breaking so many of the Scrum rules, but they're a productive, high energy team doing good work. Okay, how come their work is good? And then you start looking at what do they value, how do they interact, what do their customers need? And they've got a good thing. The only reason they're using Scrum is because they like the cadence of some of the rituals. That's helpful. But other than that, they just do what they have to do.
Yeah, I noticed that in your class, you do focus very heavily on Agile and notions of Scrum and processes with backlog grooming and
well, I do that because of one thing, and this is adapting a little bit over time. But over 80% of the companies that I interact with are using some variant of Scrum. And so I basically say, okay, the Scrum Alliance has defined what Scrum is. No one actually does it, but they've defined it. So let's look at it and say that's a baseline. And now what do people do that's different from that baseline? So I'm not saying Scrum is good. I'm not judging it. But I'm saying, okay, that's a terminology that at least we have, that we can say, how do you vary from it? And I want to give people a basis to do basically what you know to be an affinity analysis, like what's the same and what's different. Like you learn in Sesame Street when you play that game, one of these things is not like the other. So I want to look at and say, okay, like take a look at this picture, like where's Waldo? Here's Scrum, here's these guys, what's different and why, and how come they're not doing Scrum but they're getting so much value, or maybe they're not getting value, and if they did things a little bit different, they would drive more value from it. So that's why I use that. And I also use, for some cases, the by the book Kanban model. But I'm not a fan of anyone's pure agile method, that's for sure. But I do like to show people that there's a lot of different ways to develop software. And so I find if I take a framework that's pretty well understood and has a defined practice, that I can say, okay, no one does this, but maybe we can look at the variability. Like, I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, the follow-up is, tell me more about the software development practices that you enjoy. Give me like one or two examples of practices that you enjoy teaching semester after semester.
My favorite is task analysis. I love to teach people how to do task analysis, and I love the results of it. It's mind-blowing. You can just change people's whole worldview by teaching them how to do task analysis stuff. So I really, really, really enjoy that. And it's a big reveal because people are taking a software engineering course and it's like you hit them from, what is this task analysis? What do you mean task analysis? I said, yeah, understanding how people get things done. How do people do things? And if you want to be a software engineer, you're going to help people do things. so it becomes so fundamental to understanding requirements, understanding processes, development, understanding how people work together, collaboration, the whole thing. So I really love that. And I teach very often, as you probably know, the critical incident method of task analysis. And my early mentor on that, as you probably know also, is Dr. Ken Kainer, who introduced me to that type of thinking. But I've gone really far from what he taught me, and I've learned a lot of different methods. And I really enjoy teaching that.
Great. Have students ever come back or emailed you after they've graduated or at whatever time saying, Rob, here's a great practice I've learned when they get placed at a company or whatever?
All the time, John. I get to, first of all, I keep a strong relationship with many of my students for it's a lifetime guarantee, right? It's forever and for always. But there's some students of mine who are running departments at different companies, like, and I would say big giant companies. But one I'm most proud of is Airbnb, the way that they organize their software engineering and things. And I was contacted directly by the principals there saying how much my teaching had influenced their practices, which is awesome. I didn't expect that. It was totally from left field. But it was because they basically someone took my work, worked with me, had 10, 15 years experience, then went there, took some of the fundamentals that I taught and applied them. And it really is, it's gratifying when that happens to me.
So you mentioned one of the practices that you use in teaching, which is having a guest speaker come in and relate their experience to collateral that you have on slides, part of your curriculum. Is there any other teaching practice that you find particularly valuable?
Yes,
to your students?
I learned over the last two years. I've dived into teaching practices because of COVID. I had to switch to remote learning in a very sudden way without becoming an expert in remote learning. Suddenly you're doing remote teaching. And I was lucky enough that McGill gave us some seminars about what they call the flipped learning approach, where you do not do lectures. You basically do, with the class, you do activities and exercises when you're in class, and the lectures is the homework assignments. So you flip the homework with the in-class stuff. And I think that really, really works, especially for training people about stuff like software testing. I did that for two whole semesters. Just, all the lectures, we videoed them. They watched them at their own time when they want. And the lectures were there. We still have lectures, but there were videos. And the live stuff was all exercises, really well-crafted sequence of exercises. And you do one, then the next. And I always had for every exercise the teacher's edition. So I didn't want to embarrass them and show them what they did wrong in front of all their peers. Instead, I would let them work in small groups and then give them the teacher's edition, which is my answer, and then they can critique my answer or contrast it with theirs.
During a semester, you come up with your curriculum which has practices you want to make sure to cover to increase the likelihood of them being successful in the working world. Some which already have had some working experience when they take your class, I'm assuming. At the end of the semester, do you do a retrospective later on how effective that curriculum was in terms of preparing them for the working world with the variety of practices you chose?
Unfortunately, I'm an adjunct professor at a big academic university. So I'm sort of like a lone practitioner amongst a bunch of academics. And they do have a process, but I've never found it very effective. We do look at what we call, there's attributes, and we have skill attributes, and we look at what the goals of the course are from a skill attribute perspective. And the skill attribute thing is really well defined, like really clearly defined rubrics of skills you want them to learn and all this levels of maturity in the skills. And I do that analysis, and then I give in the results, and it's like a black hole. I don't get much back. Like, I think that if I was part of the full-time academic staff, I would be able to participate in that in aggregate, because you can't teach one course alone, right? A university curriculum is a program of many, many courses, and it also has prerequisites, co-requisites. There's a whole bunch of stuff interacting. And just looking at one course, yeah, I can judge a bit about my course, but they want to look at, are we forming good, solid software engineers? And I contribute to the process, but I don't really feel I get the feedback I would like.
So related to that, a student comes back to you and they got a great job and they're executing on one of the practices that you familiarized them. Maybe it's SAFe or Scaled Agile Framework or a Scrum of Scrums or Kanban, and they go, but Rob, it's horribly managed. It's a bad practice, or it's slogan based, as you say. What kind of advice do you give them to improve the practice?
Well, it depends how far up the chain they've gone in management. I will sell them my personal consulting services. That's now you described my business model there, John.
Yeah.
How does Rob get business?
Right.
I create a bunch of software engineers. They all become managers, and they hire me to help them.
Yeah, that's smart, very smart.
But they will often. I mean, there's every day or two, I do chat with past students of mine about really crazy circumstances, and we brainstorm. And we rub ideas against, throw things against the wall and try to figure out what you can do a little bit different to try to buy in. There's just incredible problems in organizations that have factors that the people trying to solve the problems are not aware of. And what I've learned is that there's always a factor that's influencing the situation around me that I'm not aware of, and probably I'll never really become aware of. And so you got to work with that unknown factor influencing things, and you got to really take some hypotheses, some guesses about how to deal with that. Throw a few darts at the wall. But as I say, by listening to what other people do, I try to inspire the thinking. I don't try to say, here, let's change the template.
Yeah.
There's certainly
it's all about influence, which is the spirit of the question. Is there's you as a consultant coming in to influence, and maybe you have more influence because you're getting paid and they don't want to waste the money and like listen to Rob. And then there's them in their first job perhaps, and they don't feel like they have influence, but yet they feel compelled to figure out how can I improve this practice.
Exactly.
And so maybe you're their mentor, right?
It's very important for me to work with people who are empowered to change things, and I've actually learned to, when I'm brought in on a mandate, to make sure that situation exists before I start, because I don't want to go there, figure out a whole bunch of things to change, and express it to some person who is caught with the tyranny of the urgent, and they never have a chance to affect change. I want to sort of say, okay, let's do baby steps. Let's identify the first level. Let's change how they do this, and then we'll look and monitor it. And if they're not engaged in that and follow up with it, me as an external consultant, I don't think I can. I don't feel comfortable. I mean, I guess some people say, "Well, take the money," but I prefer to help them out, and so I want someone inside to, really be, I guess, empowered to make some change.
Yeah. So here's an example. Let me give you this. So here's a practice. Responding to change over following a plan. That's a practice. But if the opposite could happen too, you're responding to so much change that you feel compelled that there needs to be some kind of other practice, some kind of process to manage that change and follow a process. So following a process over, responding to change. So
well, the thing is that some people get a sort of weird notion of what is a process, and so a light, effective guideline to how to deal with things might be all you need. I always used to promote myself as identifying light, effective processes, as opposed to bureaucratic, paperwork-oriented processes. If I was taking the Agile Manifesto and I'm saying responding to change is more important than following a detailed plan or something, I might agree with that. And yet, on Agile projects, I see sometimes actually more planning done than on any waterfall project I ever worked on. You just take a look at a 2-week sprint of Scrum. How much time do they spend on grooming requirements? How much time do they spend in their planning meetings? How much time do they spend doing all these activities? And then do the ratio over the duration of it. So for 2 weeks of work, you're spending 2.5 days planning. And this is sort of like, wow, that's 25% of your work is planning. And some people would say that Agile says there's emphasis not on planning. I don't know. I think that it's basically you got to sort of work on things that matter, and don't get attached to just the canon. Like some people believe that Agile development means no documentation. I don't think that that's true. I think it's reasonable documentation is needed depending on your business goals. And Agile says you should ship every sprint, and I say, well, that might not make sense for some businesses. You might want to ship every 3 months. It's
so for those of you in the audience, I haven't been good at telling you what question I'm on, but I've got 2 more questions. So if you have any questions about students that come back and say, I've learned this practice, or Rob's teaching practices, or what is a worst practice, or managing practices in general, universal practices, feel free to raise your hand or put something in the chat. So I got 2 left. Okay, so question number 7 is really more of I want your take on this. There's something known as the iron triangle, you might have heard. Scope, time, pick any 2. Quote, scope, time, cost, pick any 2. What do you think of that practice?
Well, I think it's a naive oversimplification of the complexities of real business decision making. I wish it was so simple. Choose 2, and I guess the great managers can make it that simple and can create a model that you can come up with that's that simple. I don't always have that. I have usually got tons of things that are, as I mentioned before, unknown things. There's I don't know. It's a model that if that's helpful for you to make decisions, go for it. But at the same time, remember, it's just a model, and it's a model. It's not reality. It's just a guide. It's not the real world. The real world, no way. There's just three factors. There's lots of interesting factors, and there's perception factors. For example, like if you get something to market first with the technology, even if it doesn't work, that might be the right thing to do. And it's not. Where's that in your triangle? That sort of thinking. It's not there. So the model of that triangle is to guide certain types of decision making. And if you're using tools like that to guide your decision making, that's a heuristic. Okay, it's a heuristic. It's not. Believe me, that's not something that's a provable axiom in mathematics or science. But heuristics are useful. They're useful. But what is the way you used to say it, John? You used to teach me about this all the time. Heuristics are they're
Fallible method for solving a problem, but
right. They're basically not always. They don't always work.
Yeah, right.
They're useful, but they don't always work. And so I think that I've seen a lot of models like that. NASA came up with the beautiful risk management model that I like to show people and show people how to practically use it. But it's just a model. It's considering, it's considering things based on risk, based on the probability of failure and the impact of failure. And unfortunately, in software, we do not have actuarial tables. We can't look up what is the probability of a failure. We don't have a way to do that. Not yet. Not maybe in my lifetime we will, but not yet. And so these risk models are always going to be wrong. It's just a useful hint to give you a good direction to go in, but you got to think on your feet a little bit with using them.
That's a good point you made about models, though. I wrote something down that struck me that there's a difference between a model and a practice, and a model might spawn practices, and practices from those models may be flawed, or the model might in itself be flawed, and that is, like you said, it may be oversimplifying something. So that's something to be cognizant
of. Or overcomplicating things. So you got both sides of the equation, and so what are the best models to use? Is an interesting type of question to look at, and modeling to me is a part of systems thinking, and there's a lot of great work by people like Jerry Weinberg in that area. But this is interesting. Now, how do you want to make a model? And you want to make a model that's useful but not overly complicated, so that you'll guide things. Like, for example, let's say you're trying to figure out how do you manage finding a bug. Like, what do you do if you find a bug? And shouldn't we have a process for that, or a practice for that, and I start, well, let's model that. Let's model a bug. Like, where did it come from? How do we know it's important? And you start looking at it, and I'll draw a picture, I'll visualize it, and it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to give me a guidance. And once I've got that guidance, then I can sort of say, now what's practical? What's going to fit into the context, the business, technical, organizational, cultural factors? Do we want to have a really well-defined, rigorous bug tracking process? Or do we want to empower maybe certain people in the teams to make certain decisions themselves without having going through a huge complex workflow? And I have to tell you that just that simple example, you'll go walk into companies, and it's a very revealing thing to see if people understand process modeling. To just ask the question, what do you do if you find a bug? And it's really amazing that if you can't really answer that, by the way, I ask the question, how do you know you're finished? Because if you don't know how to manage a bug, or you inconsistently manage a bug, you're never going to finish a project. It's like so fundamental to software engineering. However, I don't want to digress too much. I want to suggest that there's a complexity and a level of detail that I go for, not too much detail, but practically addressing the concerns that matter to people, especially people outside of your sphere, like the people that you're working with day by day closely. You can be very informal about how to interact with each other. You can have a sticky on a board, but if you have a management team that's going to be shipping things and deploying builds to other companies, you might need a more formal way to communicate the state of things.
What popped in my head as you were saying that, you're the founder of a notion of methodology called just-in-time testing, or JIT, J-I-T. Would you consider that a model or a set of practices for testing?
Well, what I do is I create it and I teach it as if it's a model, but I give examples of the practices. So all my case studies are examples of the practices, but the model is basically the fundamental if you will, the fundamental elements of it. And just-in-time testing, just to be very succinct here, it has got two elements: ASAP, ALAP. ASAP, as soon as possible, start collecting test ideas, and as late as possible, turn them into actionable tests. So those are the two fundamental things in just-in-time testing. And so there's a bunch of principles we can teach about that: the ideation part, the prioritization part, the implementation part. All that fits in. However, when you teach it, you can share that, but then I want to tie it into reality with the case studies, and the case studies are all real examples of it implemented. And you know, some of them are I'm lucky. I've built collections of projects. Sometimes I work on projects just for the purpose of building the examples, but I do have a lot of different examples, and that I think makes it real to people. So the model is what I sort of make in terms of teaching the method, and then the examples are where I get the process descriptions.
My last question is also another quote that I've seen on LinkedIn many times, especially lately. And the quote goes like this: "If a team manages itself for 6 months while you hire a manager, you should not be hiring, you should be promoting." So what kinds of practices can you infer, Rob, are being managed well in that example by the team?
Well, I'm not sure if is that meant as a cynical statement, or is that meant as a sort of like a reveal, like that there's a better thing you can do. I believe that there's a cultural thing in companies. Some companies are very big on developing people and helping people grow in their careers, and so that's a value system in companies. And if that's the value system in the company, then I would say that look at the people you've got and form them and help form them into the roles, rather than bringing in outside experts and hired guns. But that value system is not universal. There's other value systems too, like projectized companies, where they're basically bidding on contracts to do projects. And when you get the project, then you bring in the hired guns to do it. And you want them, you don't want to grow these people. You want to get them. You want to get the right people at the right time. The skill you want to develop is the skill to get those smart people and hire the contractors and bring them in. Like, for example, when I hired you to do the beautiful testing at Quardev, when you were working there long years and years ago, you were a hired gun. And the way I was doing that was projectized. I wasn't trying to develop my people to become Jon and the Quardev team. I was basically saying, no, I need experts who can do this job really well and meet our constraints and bring the skills to the table. So that hired gun philosophy is not wrong. It's just a different value system. And that's why I try to emphasize to people, watch out for slogans, watch out for really broad generalizations. If you can and want to develop people, and that's what they want to be developed, then yes, turn people into great managers, forget managers, leaders. Do good things and do them well, and get people buy-in. And if that's your value system, it's going to be fun to work there. It's going to be a great place, and it's going to be more like a family sometimes than it is a company. But not all companies and projects work that way.
Yeah, you were saying about guilds before, right? I saw a recent quote about, if a company calls itself a family, it's a red flag, run for the hills. They preferred the word community as opposed to family, which I think gets closer to the guild idea. But in terms of the quote, when you hear that quote, if a team manages itself for 6 months, yada yada, when you hear the word manages itself, what pops into your head about what's going on with that team? What does it mean to manage a team, or for a team to manage itself?
Well, I think that's just I think it's a mistaken expression of self-organization. So I think what they're saying is organize yourself, not manage themselves. I don't think they're looking at the multidimensional part of what management is. If you ask my opinion, that
yeah, definitely
LinkedIn quote. So that's sort of how I parse it in my head. Say, well, this is pretty naive. They think that's the self-organizing team part of Agile. That's great, but there's a lot more to management than self-organizing teams. So I suspect that that's what it is. It's also, Jon, it's a metaphor, right?
Yeah, I understand. Well, but I'm glad you brought up self-organizing, because that's a buzzword in Agile. What practices go into self-organizing?
Basic Deming stuff, feedback loops. So the self-organizing is basically you organize your project. And by the way, Carnegie Mellon did a lot of work in this area, and it's not pre-Agile. Actually, the self-organizing team and Agile are not necessarily, Agile didn't invent it. Let me put it that way. But the idea is you do an activity, let's say a month of programming or whatever it is, and then you do a retrospective, and you do a sincere retrospective, and you look at the results of your work, and you use the results of your work to make decisions about the quality of your product for sure, but you also make decisions about the method you use, and you use the results of your work to feedback, to adapt and tweak your method. And that is the basis of, I don't know if you've heard of statistical process control. What you're doing is you're looking at the output, and I always try to tell testers that you don't realize that your work, your testing work, should not just be influencing decisions about shipping or not the product or the quality of the product. You're also looking at the quality of the process that developed that product, and you should take what you've learned and use it to change and refactor. So that's the self-organizing part of Agile. It's the feedback loop, active feedback. Periodically, the periodicity is something that the sample space should be reasonable. You have to give people a chance to try and to change the method a bit, but you can't let them go forever. So a cadence of like a month is probably good for the reorganization. And the retrospective model, I think, is an excellent way to do it, but there might be other ways you get that feedback too.
Okay. All right, so that's the end of my question list. Is there any questions in the audience? Either raise your hand if you want to speak verbally, or speak or put something in Q&A. And while we wait for that, Rob, is there anything I didn't ask you that you want to make sure to get across to the audience about managing practices?
Well, yes, there's one thing that I'm really sensitive to, and that is the fallacy we're seeing today about a company that pretends to have a product when it doesn't. And there's a lot of fallacies about that. I see many companies, including some giants, including many that you know and probably use tools from, that claim to have products that they sell. But when you buy the product, it's actually, they make a project to implement it for you. So they're basically not making a product for a general market. They're selling projects that are always custom development. And I suggest that when you're looking at process models, management of things, that is very, very different to manage a product which is going to have a life and an evolution and a market, and a project which is trying to achieve a specific goal. And those are two totally different things. And I see them confused because products have leverage, and investors like leverage revenue. Investors really do. That's why they invest so much money in high tech. They want leveraged revenue. They want everybody to give $10 a month to you for the rest of your life. They love that. And that's products do that. Projects are just one-shot things that you take the money and you run. And so I'm just concerned a little bit that people are sort of making that, there's a little, I think it's not just confusion. I think people are trying to take product development models and use them on projects, and project models and use them on products, and it gets all confusing and it's muddled. So I just wanted to mention that's one thing that I'm sort of concerned about these days, and I'm seeing more of it, not less, which is sad. I guess it's sad. People are still buying products and making money, so maybe that's not sad.
Yeah. All right. All right. Seeing no questions in the chat. Oh, wait, there is something that came in. Hang on, let me look. Oh, it's his comment. So Oliver's commenting, and price is determined by product complexity. Simplicity is counterproductive. So I think there's lots of goal displacement there, says Oliver.
That's the beautiful way to put it. Goal displacement. Yeah. Yes.
Tell me about that. What is goal displacement?
Well, you're basically you sort of I don't know, you sort of suggest that we're trying to get achieve something. Like let's say, for example, we want to have I don't know, so many new products sold in a period of time, and so you basically define what a product is so that you can get it done in the period. So the goal suddenly becomes breaking down big projects and little ones so that you can count them differently. It's not a goal that really is helping to achieve a value. It's you refactor the goal to sort of help win the equation. And if you look at basically saying, hey, I like the simplicity is counterproductive, right? Let's say you pay for someone to do something. If it's a complicated thing, you want to pay more money for it. And so what's the point of coming up with a beautiful, simple solution? You actually probably want to have a more complicated solution, because that's attractive to people. It sort of displaces the goal of actually meeting whatever that business need was or the consumer need was. And this argument brings into the discussion issues like what is the minimum viable product, which is, I think, a really ridiculous thing that so many people use that term. And then you start seeing, I'm going to develop the minimum viable product. Did you ever go to the store and say, I want to buy the minimum viable product? Really? Do you want to buy the minimum thing? No, you want to buy something that's useful and does the job and is robust. And it might have some features you don't use, but you don't go there and say, I'm only going to take the minimum one that meets my basic needs, and that's all. And yet people are using that. And so that becomes a ridiculous goal. Because if you look at a company trying to develop a product and it's starting from scratch, they will very often say, let's define the minimum ones so we get out the door. And I don't know if that's a reasonable goal. I think that's what an example for me of, we used to call it a beta. Yes. That's right.
Yes, MVP is become beta. Yes.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Our soft launch. We're gonna yeah.
You hear my thinking about that, John? I could probably come up with a smoother way to describe it, but
That's fine. All right. Okay. Thank you, Rob, for being here. I had fun. Thanks for entertaining my whims of questions. What's the best email you can be reached at? You prefer MeBug or is there a McGill edu?
Actually, these days, robsab@gmail.com is the easiest one. I have a whole bunch of emails.
robsab@gmail.com.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's it.
Rob Sab.
Very,
Okay.
very simple. And
Okay.
that's probably the easiest way to reach me. And as much as I sound like I'm busy, I'm always looking for cool projects to work on. And so keep me in mind if you have a cool project.
Awesome. There it is. Okay. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Shelley, any closing thoughts?
No, just really appreciate all the stuff you guys talked about tonight. It was really interesting, and thanks so much. And thanks for everybody joining us this evening. So it was great to have you.
You'll post the recording also on LinkedIn, right? I think.
Correct.
Okay. Awesome. Great. Thank you, Shelley. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Joe. And thanks, everybody, for being here. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I had a couple of things I wanted to add on to the tail end of that, and I think that's a great takeaway, Rob, that how much you embrace the idea of feeling empowered, and that's how Quardev hires, and that's how I think everybody should feel whenever they go to work. I almost want to put that on a sticker on my front door window. Feel empowered. Do what you do best and bring your ideas to the table. Man, I hope everybody has a job like that. And the other one was when you asked the question, John, about time, cost, and scope. I can tell you from my experience, just from my experience, that time and cost are the priority of those three things. You want to get out there and you want to be able to afford it before you go broke. And the scope, you can add to it all the time and you get people to sign up and you can send emails and say, hey, we just updated this app or whatever it is. So that's my take on that. And then we're going to break a little bit from our tradition of not turning this too commercial, but we have so many PM positions available that people are asking for our help in recruiting, that I thought I'd let Cindy introduce herself, and maybe you guys can get in touch if you're interested in doing anything like that. So Cindy.
Hey Joe, thank you. Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Awesome. So we did want to just let anyone know, if you are interested in a new challenge, maybe an environment that's using a different methodology that you'd like to jump in and take advantage of, we do have some positions open, both local to the Seattle area. And then we also have 2 positions that are remote or based on the East Coast. So feel free to reach out. You can connect online or just reach out directly to our team. And we'd love to connect you with those teams to see if they might be a great fit.
Great. Thank you, Cindy. Yeah, it's a hiring frenzy out there, so we are happy to help wherever we can. So
It definitely is. Now's the time.
Yeah.
If you're wanting to try something new and are really looking for a different environment to stretch your wings, now's the time to do it for sure.
That's for sure. So keep cranking out those PMs there, Rob, and the software testers.
We get about 400 a year.
Great. We need them.
Yep.
Cool deal. All right. Well, thanks everybody so much for your time tonight, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.